The city, the place that always had power.
The first high-voltage alternating current transmission line in the United States ran 26 miles from Niagara Falls to Buffalo in 1896, carrying 11,000 volts. Its maintenance crews had no tools rated for that voltage and no training specific to high-voltage work, because no such training existed. They had telegraph lineman skills and utility salaries. The electrical world began tracking lineman fatalities that year. The format was consistent: the man's name, the utility, the voltage, the cause of death. Some entries added a detail. One entry reads that he had been warned about that section 3 times. He did not believe the line was live. If you are new to steel and sweat, this channel covers the machines and the men of American industrial history, the things that built the country and what those things cost. Subscribe and leave a comment below with the next story you want us to dig into. This is the story of the men who strung the high-voltage transmission grid across the United States between 1882 and 1920, examined through the trade journals, accident ledgers, and coroner's reports that documented what that work cost at the human level. The engineers who designed the systems have names that appear in every history of the electrical era: Edison, Westinghouse, Tesla, Kelvin. The linemen who climbed the poles and strung the wire have names that appear in the electrical world's incident log, next to the utility, the voltage, and the cause of death. But the distance between those two sets of names is the story of how the American electrical grid was actually built, and who paid the price the engineering journals did not calculate. To understand why linemen died at the rate they did, and why the rate persisted for as long as it did, you have to understand what the electrical industry was building and how fast it was building it, and what kind of man it recruited to do the climbing. On September 4th, 1882, Thomas Edison threw the switch on the Pearl Street station in Lower Manhattan. The plant served 1 square mile of New York City with direct current at approximately 110 volts, distributed through buried cables to 85 customers and 400 lamps. Direct current at 110 volts was not lethal under normal contact conditions. A man who touched a live direct current distribution wire would feel it but survive it. Edison understood this. It was part of his argument for direct current. His system was designed to be safe at the point of contact, and it was. But it was also nearly useless beyond about 1 mile from the generating station. At the distances, direct current could travel without losing most of its energy to resistance. You could not power a city, you could power a neighborhood. The arc lighting companies that had been stringing wires across American cities since the late 1870s understood the power transmission problem and had solved it with voltage. Arc lamps required high voltage alternating current, typically above 3,000 volts, to produce the intensely bright light they delivered. That voltage could travel far enough to make central station arc lighting economically viable. By 1881, Brush Electric had installed arc lamp systems in New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore, San Francisco, and dozens of other cities. The light was brilliant, the wires carrying it were lethal, and the men working those wires didn't know they were lethal in a way that was fundamentally different from anything they had worked with before. The telegraph lineman of the 1870s worked with voltages measured in dozens of volts. He touched live telegraph wires as a matter of routine. The shock was unpleasant but not dangerous. But his hands were his instruments. He felt the line with his fingers to diagnose problems. He stripped insulation with his teeth when he didn't have a knife, and he made contact with bare wires as a normal part of his working method. That set of practices, learned on telegraph wire at low voltage, was the skill set the electrical industry hired. There were thousands of trained telegraph linemen in the 1880s. There were almost no trained electrical linemen because that occupation didn't exist yet. The utilities hired what was available, and they put those men on poles that now carried something categorically different from anything they'd experienced. The overhead wire infrastructure of an American city in 1889 was, by any objective description, an unmanaged disaster. In Lower Manhattan, poles carried 50 or 60 wires at multiple crossbars, stacked 10 or 12 feet tall. Telegraph wires at low voltage, telephone wires at low voltage, and arc lighting wires at 3,000 volts all shared the same poles. They often touched each other, were inadequately insulated, and carried unknown loads because the systems had been installed piecemeal by competing companies with no coordination. A lineman sent to the top of a pole to remove a dead telegraph wire had no reliable way to know whether any of the wires around him were carrying lethal current. The wires did not look different. There was no visual indicator. The only reliable way to know what a wire was carrying was to have accurate records of which wire belonged to which company and what that company was running on it. In most cities, those records did not exist in any usable form. On October 11th, 1889, a Western Union telegraph lineman named John Feeks climbed a 50-foot pole at the corner of Chambers and Center Streets in Lower Manhattan. The pole had 15 crossbars and carried more than 250 wires. Feeks had been sent to remove 6 dead telegraph wires. Because he was working telegraph wire, he left his rubber boots and gloves at the bottom of the pole. Telegraph work did not require them. He wore metal spiked climbing boots, as telegraph linemen always did, which gave him better grip on the wood. What Feeks did not know was that several blocks away, a Westinghouse arc lighting wire carrying alternating current at high voltage had shorted against his telegraph wire during a windstorm the previous night. The short was invisible from the street. There was no indication at the pole that the telegraph wire Feeks was working was now live with arc light and current. It was 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the lunch hour on one of the busiest blocks in Manhattan. Several thousand people were on the street below. Feeks slipped. He grabbed the nearest wire to catch himself. The current entered through his bare right hand and exited through the metal spikes in his left boot. He died instantly, his body rigid, locked against the crossbar. His hand continued to burn against the wire. His mouth and throat smoldered. The body hung there for 45 minutes while the crowd watched and the fire department waited for someone to turn off the current. Nellie Bly, the journalist, was in the crowd. She reported what she saw in detail. But the death of John Feeks established not a new safety standard. It established a public crisis. Thomas Edison's company, which sold direct current at low voltage and had argued for years that alternating current was too dangerous for city use, now had exactly the kind of evidence it needed. The newspapers ran the Feeks story on their front pages. The phrase electric wire panic entered the vocabulary. Editorialists demanded that alternating current lines be buried underground. Politicians held hearings. The specific question of what killed John Feeks and why, meaning the question of how high voltage alternating current interacted with the human body and what distinguished a survivable contact from a fatal one, received essentially no serious scientific attention. The political crisis was managed. The science was not pursued. But the science mattered for the men who would climb the poles for the next 4 decades. Because what kills a man on an electrical line depends on variables that were not understood in 1889. They were only partially understood when the Niagara line went live in 1896. High voltage and low voltage kill differently. A contact with a 100,000 volt transmission line is instantaneous. The energy overwhelms the body's electrical system so completely that cardiac arrest is immediate and total. There is no intermediate stage. The man does not experience what is happening to him. A contact with a 2,300 volt distribution line, the standard secondary distribution voltage in American cities through the 1890s and the 1900s, is different. It causes ventricular fibrillation, a disruption in the heart's electrical rhythm that prevents effective pumping of blood. Fibrillation is a survivable condition if interrupted quickly. A defibrillator reverses it. But in 1900, no defibrillator existed. Fibrillation progressed to death unless the contact was broken in time, and whether the contact was broken in time depended on whether the man could release the wire. This is where the physics of muscle response mattered. At intermediate voltages, the current that enters the hand and attempts to exit through the feet contracts the muscles of the forearm and hand involuntarily. The grip tightens. The man cannot release the wire because the current itself is making him grip harder. He is holding himself to the thing that is killing him, not by choice but by physics, and he cannot stop doing it. How many linemen reading the Electrical World's incident reports in 1896 understood that distinction? Leave a comment below. The answer is almost none. The mechanism of fibrillation was first described in the medical literature in 1874 and was not well understood in clinical medicine until the early 20th century. The connection between low-voltage alternating current contact and involuntary grip was observed but not explained. The safety practices that existed, such as the rubber gloves and boots that Feeks had left at the bottom of his pole, were adopted empirically because they seemed to help, not because anyone had worked out the mechanism by which they helped. The training that the electrical industry provided to linemen in the 1890s covered the practical skills of climbing, stringing, and splicing wire. It did not cover what happened when the wire was live and you touched it, because the people running the utilities did not have a coherent account of what happened in those cases. The Niagara-Buffalo transmission line, which went live on November 16, 1896, carried 11,000 volts on bare copper wire strung on wooden poles between 35 and 65 feet tall. The 200 men who set those poles worked in 6 gangs under Superintendent John A. Wilson. The construction took roughly 3 months. The electrical journals covered the engineering in detail, describing the porcelain insulators from the Imperial Porcelain Works in Trenton, the transformer stations at both ends, the switchgear problems on opening night, and the choice of 3-phase over 2-phase transmission. The coverage of the construction laborers is minimal. They set the poles, strung the wire, and moved to the next section. Their names are not in the electrical journals. Their occupational accident rate is not in the construction reports. But what is in the electrical world incident log are the fatality reports from the distribution systems that the Niagara line fed. As the grid extended outward from Buffalo in the months and years after 1896, more men climbed more poles at more voltages with the same fundamental problem. The industry was building at a rate that outpaced the development of safe working methods. If you are finding this history as important as anything we have covered on this channel, go ahead and hit subscribe now and leave a comment below with the next story you want to see. Between the 1890s and the 1930s, 1 in 3 linemen were killed on the job. That figure is from industry occupational analysis, not from a systematic death tracking system, because no systematic death tracking system existed until the 1920s, when the federal government began requiring occupational fatality reporting. Before 1920, what we know about lineman deaths comes from the electrical world incident reports, from state labor commissioner annual reports, and from the accident ledgers that some utilities kept internally. The Edison Electric Illuminating Company's accident ledger for New York City from 1890 to 1905 is in the New York State Archive. The National Electric Light Association, founded in 1885, kept incident records that are in the Smithsonian Institution archive. What these records document is a specific pattern of failure that repeated itself across the entire expansion of the grid. The man was doing familiar work on unfamiliar voltage. He knew how to climb the pole, how to splice the wire, how to rig the blocks for a pulling conductor. He did not know, with precision, what voltage his wire was carrying, whether the adjacent wires were live or dead, or whether the insulation on the tools he was using rated for the voltage he was working. The electrical industry was buying tools off the shelf from telegraph supply houses and from manufacturers who had no particular reason to rate those tools for electrical use. A rubber-handled pliers designed for telegraph work was not necessarily safe at 2,300 volts. A rubber-soled boot designed for outdoor work was not necessarily rated as an electrical insulator. The ratings and testing standards for lineman rubber goods did not exist as a formal system until the early 1900s, and they were not uniformly adopted until considerably later. The International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers was founded in 1891, 2 years after the Feeks death and 1 year before General Electric's formation. The founding purpose was wages and working conditions, but safety was embedded in those working conditions from the beginning. The union's early organizing arguments included the specific claim that electrical linemen worked with hazards that were not adequately compensated by the wages they received, and that utilities had financial incentive to move workers through dangerous situations quickly rather than safely. That argument was correct in its mechanics. A utility expanding its distribution grid had revenue incentive to get lines strung and energized as fast as possible. The linemen doing the stringing had a personal incentive to work carefully. The incentives did not align, and the men doing the climbing were not the ones setting the schedule. What the linemen actually did in the specific physical sequence of work on a live distribution circuit in 1900 involved a chain of decisions. Each decision had a safe version and a fast version. Each decision the man made without adequate information about the risk he was taking. He climbed the pole. What did a safe work sequence actually look like on a live distribution circuit in 1900, and where did it reliably break down? The pole was wooden, set in soil, carrying moisture that could conduct current from any grounded wire to the climber's body through his spikes and his hands. That moisture turned the pole and the ground into part of the electrical path. The safe version involved inspecting the pole for rot, checking the insulators for cracks, and identifying every wire on the pole and its voltage before touching anything. The fast version involved climbing to the work position and starting. He identified the wire he was working. In a city with overlapping utility infrastructure, multiple wires from multiple companies ran on the same poles: telegraph, telephone, arc lighting, incandescent distribution, and street railway feeders. The safe approach was to call the company, get records, and confirm which wire was which. The fast approach was to ask the crew foreman, or to make an educated guess based on wire gauge and position. He moved around the pole to reach his work position. In doing so, he moved through a space occupied by wires he was not working on, wires that might or might not be live, wires he could not determine without contact and that he was trying not to touch. The clearance between his body and those wires depended on how narrow the crossarm was, how tightly the wires were spaced, and how far he had to reach to get to his specific wire. Clearance mattered, and it varied from pole to pole. He did the work, splicing, cutting, pulling, and tying with bare hands or with tools whose insulating properties he had no objective way to verify. He climbed down and moved to the next pole. The next pole could look the same and still be more dangerous. The man who survived that sequence long enough developed a practical working knowledge of where the danger zones were on specific poles and on specific circuits. He knew which sections were consistently problematic. He knew which wires on his route were owned by which company. He knew which ground conditions made a particular pole more hazardous than it looked. Those danger zones were learned over time. That knowledge was entirely informal, transmitted from experienced lineman to new man verbally, or not transmitted at all if the experienced man was gone. The electrical world incident reports repeatedly note men who were new to a particular circuit, men who had transferred from another district, and men who were covering for an absent regular. The regulars survived longer on average because their knowledge was calibrated to their specific infrastructure. When a man worked unfamiliar wire, his risk went up significantly because none of his empirical knowledge applied. The incident entry that appeared in Electrical World in 1896 recorded what happened at the end of the chain. It listed the man's name, the utility, the voltage, and the cause. It did not capture the decisions, the conditions, the training he'd received, or whether the utility had any information that could have prevented the specific contact that killed him. The format was designed for documentation, not for analysis. The industry read those incident reports, but a list of names and voltages does not tell you what to change. What did change, and when, and what does the answer say about what was possible before the change? The first systematic rubber goods testing standards for electrical linemen were developed in the early 1900s. The first formal live line tool specifications, including the hot stick, an insulated pole that allows work on an energized line without direct contact, were developed from roughly 1905 to 1915. Apprenticeship programs with specific electrical safety content began appearing in the 19-teens, partly driven by IBEW organizing and partly by utility risk management. But the casualty rate through the 1920s remained high. 1 in 3 linemen killed on the job is not the rate for a mature industry with mature safety systems. It is the rate for an industry that had not yet decided that reducing that number was worth the investment. The federal government's first systematic occupational fatality reporting requirement under the Bureau of Labor Statistics began producing usable data in the early 1920s. By the late 1920s, electrical utilities had enough actuarial data from their own accident ledgers and workers' compensation claims to understand what specific conditions produced the most deaths. The agency that would become OSHA had its first electrical safety standards in the 1930s. The formal, energized electrical work safety regulations that govern current practice in the United States were finalized and updated through the 1970s and the 1990s. The Niagara to Buffalo transmission line, which first carried 11,000 volts on November 16, 1896, was the technical proof of concept for a grid that would reach across the continent. The voltage levels that followed made 11,000 look modest: 33,000 volts by 1900, 60,000 volts by 1910, 110,000 volts by 1913, and 220,000 volts by the 1920s. Each increase in voltage made long-distance transmission more efficient, and it made contact with a live wire more definitively fatal. The men who maintained those lines had tools and training that improved incrementally, typically lagging the voltage increase by years. The bare copper cable that ran on wooden poles between Niagara Falls and Buffalo at 11,000 volts on November 16, 1896, powered the street railway in Buffalo at midnight, exactly as planned. The engineering press covered the opening in detail. The Buffalo Evening News called it a wonder. The electrical engineers and investors who had worked on the project for 6 years had what they had been working toward. The men who had set the poles in 6 gangs through the summer and fall of 1896 were not at the midnight ceremony. They had moved to the next project. Electrical World incident reports from the subsequent years are in the archive. The format is consistent: the man's name, the utility, the voltage, the cause of death. And the names accumulate across every year of grid expansion. Some entries include additional detail. He had been warned. He did not believe the line was live. The grid they built is in the walls of every building in the country. The men who built it are in the incident log of a trade journal, recorded in the format the editor established for the purpose, which noted what the industry needed to know and stopped there. That record is in the Smithsonian Institution archive, in the New York State Archive, and in Electrical World's bound volumes. If this kind of history matters to you, subscribe to Steel and Sweat and leave a comment below with the next story you want us to dig into. Thanks for watching.